Good evening, my children of the night. Let us see what beautiful music we can make together. Okay, enough of that horrible impression. Yes, welcome to the first episode proper of A Monstrous October. Hopefully you've already watched the intro video and know what's going on, because I intend to waste no further time in getting on with this review.
I am Dracula. A moment ago, I stumbled upon a most amazing phenomenon. Something so incredible, I mistrust my own judgment. Look.
Dracula. The very mention of the name brings to mind things so evil, so fantastic, so degrading. You wonder if it isn't all a dream, a nightmare.
Rats. Rats. Thousands. Millions of them.
But no, this is no dream. This is Dracula, the original terrifying story of a maniac and a man who lived after death, lived on human blood, took the form of a vampire bat, and lured innocent girls to a fate truly worse than death.
Dracula? Oh, what's he done to you, dearie? Tell me.
He came to me. He opened a thing in his arm, and he made me drink.
Is the classic 1931 film Dracula scary anymore? Unless you are incredibly sensitive or jumpy to an almost ridiculous degree, the answer will probably end up being, not really, no. But that doesn't prevent it from still being one of the greatest and most important horror films of all time. Understand that before Dracula was made, Hollywood was completely resistant to the idea of the supernatural horror, or even horror films of any kind in general. Indeed, it took years for this film to get made, despite it being based off a stage play that by that point had run for years and had already brought in millions. Dracula changed everything and opened the door for all that was to come after. And I don't just mean the other Universal horror classics such as Frankenstein, The Wolfman, The Mummy, and so many more. I'm talking about pretty much any other horror film ever made. They all owe at least some small debt to this movie, and it's just one reason of many that Dracula remains such a seminal piece of filmmaking, even if some of its elements haven't exactly aged well. Of course, one cannot talk about the 1931 Dracula without addressing Bela Lugosi's performance as the titular vampire. And while countless words have already been written about his portrayal of the Count, it really is not possible to say enough about it. Lugosi had already originated the part in the aforementioned stage play to great success, and yet he literally remained the studio's last choice, with originally the part meant to go to famous man of 1,000 faces Lou Chaney. Chaney's tragic and sudden death in 1930 from pneumonia, however, put the kibosh on these plans, and after actor turned down the role, at last Lugosi was given the nod, and we should all be thankful for this. In Dracula, Bela Lugosi does more with a single silent stare than some actors have managed in entire films. As a non-native English speaker, his take on the character could one moment feature this strange charisma and charm, as if he was just this odd, eccentric European gent, slightly strange in his ways, but still pleasant enough all told. And then suddenly, he removes this false personality, like a man removing a cloak, and all that's left in its wake is this silent and unblinking creature that, if it ever was human, has long since ceased to be such. Make no mistake, Lugosi's Dracula is a monster through and through, but he still managed to also inject occasional moments of humanity into his performance, as if to suggest this grand old monster wasn't always this way. It makes the character more interesting than he otherwise might have been, and certainly in the years since this film, we've seen enough god-awful takes on Dracula to help support this idea. Lugosi's performance is the key to what makes the 1931 Dracula so memorable, beyond just the fact that it was the first time the Count was properly and officially put to film. Lugosi's participation, for all the tragic results it would have on his later career and personal life, was indispensable, and one need only look at the Spanish-language version of Dracula for proof. This was early in the days of the transition to sound, and as such, Hollywood was still trying to figure out what did and didn't work in regards to this massive change in the medium of film. For whatever odd reason, simply dubbing over films at the time was considered cheating somehow, and so instead, studios would often refilm pictures entirely, using the same basic script, but with different actors, a different director, different production crews, and of course, usually a much smaller budget. Interestingly enough, the Spanish version of Dracula was actually shot concurrently with its English counterpart, and also used the same sets, filming at night so as to make this setup viable. Indeed, there are even shots from the English version used in this version. And overall, from a purely technical perspective, this alternate take on Dracula ended up featuring better visuals, a more coherent and longer story, and an overall feel that brings it far closer in line to what we consider modern filmmaking than its English counterpart. In large part, this is because the English version of Dracula was directed by Tod Browning, a man who got his start in the silent era and never really managed to fully adapt to the advent of sound. Browning's Dracula ends up feeling a bit like a halfway point between a sound film and a silent one, and indeed, so early in the transition was this, that Universal was able to re-edit the 1931 Dracula into a silent film for theaters that had not yet converted to sound with little trouble. Browning's Dracula lacks much in the way of real character development or a well-put-together plot, and visually it's far more static than its Spanish counterpart as well. And yet it's Browning's Dracula that we remember, and with good reason. The 1931 Spanish version of Dracula was included with the DVD set I bought for these reviews, and indeed I watched it, and what I found was a perfectly serviceable take on the Dracula story. It didn't have, for example, the dragging middle portions and weird plot jumps of the English version, but it also lacked Lugosi, and that made all the difference. Without him, the Spanish version of Dracula is simply just another take on a story that in the intervening years has been adapted and readapted countless times. It does its job, but I doubt it would have caught the imaginations of audiences in the same way that Lugosi's version did. Indeed, without him, it's easy to picture a world where Dracula does not become the smash hit that would open the door for the subsequent flood of Universal monster films we'll be examining throughout the rest of this month. And take away those films, and it's probably not exaggerating to say that the entire face of modern film as we know it would have been dramatically changed in ways we probably couldn't ever hope to fully imagine. That's because ultimately, the 1931 Dracula's place in film history remains undeniable. Of course, elements of the film, such as the patently obvious rubber bat on a string used throughout, to name just one, are utterly ridiculous by today's standards, to the point that a modern movie viewer being actually frightened by the film seems inconceivable. Yet if Dracula is no longer as horrifying as it was in its day, the film still has a remarkable power to it all the same. Better films await in this series, to be sure, but they all sprung from this single source. And whatever its flaws, it's hard not to get caught up in the film's moody and at times even surrealistic opening, or the wonderful give and take that occurs anytime Lugosi's Dracula is forced to confront Edward von Sloane's Professor Van Helsing. Sloane, incidentally, is an actor we'll see return multiple times in the course of this series, including when he reprised the role of Van Helsing in Dracula's Daughter. Overall, the 1931 version of Dracula is a mess, to be sure, but what a mess at that. Countless wannabes have and will continue to follow, but for many this will ever be the true once-and-future telling of one of the most memorable stories ever written. And if you've never seen this classic bit of Hollywood, then I recommend you put aside your modern sensibilities and sit back and enjoy the masterpiece that is Dracula. And that's going to do it for this episode of A Monstrous October. Come back tomorrow as we head back out to the graveyard to take a look at that other 1931 horror classic, Frankenstein.